Hello and welcome to the Intellect's Cove. My name is Colin Fairley. I'm a pragmatist philosopher and political theorist based at Queen's University in Canada. And this video is the third installment that addresses Chapter 1 of my new book, Aging and the Ethics of Longevity Science, published with Oxford University Press. And this one is going to focus on the framing of experimental science in Mary Shelley's excellent novel from 1818, Frankenstein. This is the third video that deals with Chapter 1. The two previous were entitled Science as a Moral Enterprise and Wisdom versus Knowledge. And so this is the third video that supplements those other two to give you a kind of a bird's eye perspective about some of the themes covered in the first chapter, in Chapter 1 of my new book. Now, I have to say that this section was actually the most fun to write. I had read Mary Shelley's Frankenstein back at university as a first-year undergraduate, and as I was working on this book for a long time, I somehow just decided to go back and reread that novel, and there were many interconnections between the issues that I was exploring with respect to the role of imagination in experimental science and in medical science more generally. And I thought addressing Mary Shelley's novel would be a great way of framing and conveying the different types of issues that arise with respect to how translational science is framed. So Mary Shelley and Frankenstein, originally published in 1818, and subsequent editions came out over the next 2 decades, or The Modern Prometheus as its subtitle. I'm going to assume that most of my audience is somewhat familiar with Frankenstein, though I would say the kind of Hollywood portrayal of Frankenstein is very different from the novel. If you haven't read the novel, I would really encourage you to. It's actually a great work in fiction. The human mind is capable of imagining both dystopic futures and utopic futures. But what's the appropriate imaginative frame to invoke with respect to biomedical innovations that will come from experimental science, especially science on the biology of aging? So actually, my book is mostly about the role of imagination in medical science and in science communication. And I deploy a multifaceted normative analysis to this topic to make the case for shifting our aspirations from the sole focus on trying to delay mortality into later life by targeting every disease of aging to supplementing that with an aspiration to slow down the rate of biological aging to increase the health span and compress the period of life people manage multimorbidity. Right, so Mary Shelley's Frankenstein has many different ways to interpret it, and my book is not a work of literature on Frankenstein. But I want to highlight the character Victor Frankenstein. So this is the doctor, not the creature that's created by Victor Frankenstein. And what we see is that he adopts a number of different attitudes towards experimental science. And I think this is there are many important lessons that can be learned by reflecting on Victor's oscillation between these different dispositions. Remember that there's a quote from John Dewey that I used in the first video for this chapter where he sees philosophy as a theory of education about what's the appropriate dispositions to take to nature and to life. And I want to focus on the dispositions we should take towards experimental science. And what's fascinating about Mary Shelley writing in the early 19th century is that it amplified many of the concerns her contemporaries had about science breaching the bounds between life and death. And the harms that she envisions are of course, imaginary, but the potential benefits that came from the experimental science that was actually in the early stages of development at the time that she was writing are often neglected. And so I want to do this juxtaposition between the actual benefits of the experimental science that came out of the time that she was writing versus the hypothetical imagined harms of the creature. So we can see at least 3 distinct dispositions that Victor takes towards experimental science throughout Mary Shelley's Frankenstein. The very first one is the one that he begins with, which is a very Cavalier attitude that, humans can just control nature, and we do so for the sake of mere satisfying of our curiosity, rather than thinking about the potential consequences for humanity and for planetary health of manipulating the physical world in novel ways. Then we see Victor go in the complete opposite direction. He becomes a technophile, a conservative with respect to experimental science. Michael Oakeshott describes conservatism as a disposition that prefers the familiar to the unknown, the tried to the untried, and the sufficient to the abundant. And this is an expression of what I refer to in later chapters of geroconservatism. That is, those who have reservations or are opposed to the aspiration to utilize experimental science to intentionally modulate the rate of human aging. And then the third and the very final, it's a very brief articulation, but it occurs in the very conclusion of Mary Shelley's Frankenstein, when Victor Frankenstein is chasing the creature through the Arctic. He's on Walton's ship, and there's a couple of comments that he makes that leaves the door open to what Maxwell and Kitcher call wisdom inquiry science and responsible biology. And this is the tenuous middle ground between the Cavalier attitude and the conservative attitude. There's one that's ethically informed and responsible about approaching experimental science, and that is the approach that I want to encourage us to pursue with respect to translational gerontology. All right, so early on in the book, we see Victor Frankenstein, when he's only 15, he observes lightning destroy the mighty oak tree. And this is his kind of awakening that the natural world is very powerful. And he's very curious about why, how does the natural world operate, and can humans control through experimentation the power of nature? Now, in the original edition of Mary Shelley's Frankenstein, she doesn't actually describe how the creature is created. In later versions of the book, she suggests that actually electricity is how the creature is created. And in the popular characterizations of Frankenstein, of course, it's lightning hitting him. But so there's a very powerful kind of metaphor in the very beginning when we see the power of nature and Victor's curiosity about how can you harness that power for human purposes. And then Victor attends the University of Ingolstadt to study chemistry, and he describes being influenced by a Professor Walton, who is a chemist. And this passage here from Frankenstein, he says that, in paraphrasing what Waldman mentioned in his lectures, he says that chemists have acquired new and almost unlimited powers. They can command the thunders of heaven, mimic the earthquake, and even mock the invisible world with its own shadow. So Professor Waldman exemplifies this mastery narrative that, there are no limits to what humans can do, and they can just, begin to experiment with nature without worrying about any adverse societal implications of experimental science. And biographers of Mary Shelley suggest that actually Professor Waldman, the comments of Professor Waldman sound very similar to an actual chemist that was alive at the time, Sir Humphrey Davy, who made a number of important scientific innovations. And biographers of Mary Shelley suggest that she would have been very familiar with Sir Humphrey Davy. Her father, the anarchist William Godwin, was friends with Davy. And so she was very much aware of what science was being undertaken at the time that she was writing. And the Waldman character seems to be based actually on Sir Humphrey Davy and the assertion that there's no limits to what humans can do in terms of command and control over nature. So this is the first expression of this kind of Cavalier attitude to experimental science, that just follow our curiosity without any worry about what the potential societal implications of intervening in nature might actually be. And then, of course, in chapter 4 of the novel, we see, what happens when that Cavalier attitude is taken, is played out in practice. And we see Victor create the creature. All right, it's a rainy night at like 1 or 2 in the morning, and all of a sudden the eyes open and the creature comes to life. And so this is the beginning of a transformation that we see in Victor's attitude as the creature goes on to basically kill everybody that he loved. It kills his youngest brother. It kills Justine. It kills his best friend. It kills his new bride, his father, and spoiler alert, leads to Victor Frankenstein's own demise as he, goes off to the Arctic to try to trace down the creature and, is unlikely to ever return. And here is a passage where we see the full articulation of this conservative temperament that Victor Frankenstein has taken on after the creature has wreaked its havoc in his life. Learn from me, if not by my precepts, at least by my example, how dangerous is the acquirement of knowledge, and how much happier that man is who believes his native town to be the world, than he who aspires to become greater than his nature will allow. So we see a complete turnaround from Victor Frankenstein, initially being quite a Cavalier enthusiast for experimentation, with no concerns about any adverse consequences of experimental science, to a kind of a status quo bias that actually the way things are already is the best that they could be, and all we can do is open a Pandora's box that will create harm. And so we're better off to just be happy with the status quo knowledge we have and relinquish any aspiration to learn more about the natural world and to try to acquire that knowledge through experimentation. So between these two positions is a middle ground that I think is the sage attitude to take. I think there's harms both with a Cavalier experimentation, a scientist who's working on an organism that could escape the laboratory and end up causing a pandemic and killing millions of people. That would be grossly unjust and unethical. You want to be responsible in the regulation of experimental science. But conversely, there's a harm to being too conservative and to eschewing any of the benefits that translational science could bring. And so I want to amplify a few of these points that are relevant to the time frame in which Mary Shelley was actually writing. So Mary Shelley primes our concern that science will breach the bounds between life and death. But there are many examples from her novel and her time period where we see actually this breaching was actually morally laudable. And the first one I'll note is one that actually is relevant to Mary Shelley herself. Her mother, Mary Wollstonecraft, an excellent feminist political theorist, attempted to commit suicide twice. And in one of those attempts, she tried to drown herself. I believe it was the second suicide attempt. And she was rescued from drowning. And the Royal Humane Society was created in 1774. At the time, it was the more cumbersome title, the Society for the Recovery of Persons Apparently Drowned. And this science of resuscitation was very shocking to many of the contemporaries of Mary Shelley, because you had individuals that looked like they were dead, right? They're floating in the water, right? There was a surprisingly high number of people that ended up drowning. Many people went swimming, were either weak swimmers or couldn't swim at all. They drowned. They thought they were dead. They buried them. And then, as they were being buried, they came back to life because they weren't actually dead. They could be resuscitated. So this science of resuscitation was perceived by many to be breaching the bounds between life and death, because somebody looked dead, their body's floating in the water, and yet you might start to try to prepare them for burial and they came back to life, right? Because they weren't actually dead. By learning more about drowning, the Royal Humane Society actually saved countless lives by saving people who weren't yet dead but had drowned. And so we certainly wouldn't want to eschew this science by saying, well, it's breaching the bounds between life and death, and so we're no longer going to save drowning victims because this, creates some perceived harm of breaching, the bounds between life and death. And that stemmed from the fact that we really didn't know about how drowning impacts survival and death, and that there's somebody may be drowned, but not beyond the point where you could save them and restore healthy life. Another example that's relevant to Mary Shelley is maternal health. So Mary Shelley's mother, Mary Wollstonecraft, died shortly after giving birth to Mary Shelley, and she was 38, which would be an age of advanced maternal, which would be an advanced age for pregnancy, which comes with a number of health complications. So science has made significant progress since the early 19th century with reducing the risk of mortality in childbirth. So again, that's an area of science where you could argue it breached the bounds between life and death. Why not simply go with the early 19th century mortality rate for childbirth? But I think now we'd say that that's a huge scientific progress, and we've helped save the lives of countless mothers who would have died in childbirth had public health not made these advances. Another example is the development of the modern defibrillator. Here's an image of the first prototype. So initially, this there was experimentation on birds that would be receive electric shock. It looks like they're dead, and then they'd be revived with their heart by giving them another shock. And so, while our minds might be horrified at the idea of Frankenstein coming back to life through an electric shock, now people, that are having cardiac arrest, they may get a shock to their heart, and this can return normal rhythm to the heart and save them. So something that sounds scary in the context of Mary Shelley's Frankenstein actually is a life-saving intervention in the real world. And finally, the creature in Frankenstein is made of organs from a bunch of different donors. And so again, our imagination can go into dark places when we think about how scary it is to have a person who's composed of body parts from distinct past people. But the first successful kidney transplant in the 1950s led to the Nobel Prize in medicine, and tens of thousands of lives are saved every year from organ transplantation. And so we wouldn't want to forfeit the benefits of organ donation because we're worried about breaching the bounds between life and death, because those people who are deceased and have donated their organs are providing a lifeline for those who need organ transplantation in order to survive and live the remainder of their life in a healthy condition. So Mary Shelley's Frankenstein is a great example of the role of imagination. We see Victor's oscillation from the Cavalier scientific experimentalist to a conservative. And right at the very end, when he's, in the Arctic, the very last thing he says is that perhaps it didn't have to play out this way, that there was, a way of approaching science where you took the greater good of humanity into consideration and averted the disaster that befell him with the creation of the creature. But that is the 3 videos help give you a summary of some of the main themes taken from chapter 1 of my new book, Aging and the Ethics of Longevity Science.